You know, children spend more of their time, their awake time, in school than anywhere else. In fact, in America today, our children spend 56 hours asleep, 21 hours eating or snacking. None of that surprises us. About 17 or 18 hours watching television or involved on the internet. And if you're involved in church work like I've been for years, you know this challenge. 2 hours a week in church, 2 hours maybe in small group, and even family time, a meaningful conversation is highly limited these days. And so if you really want to influence a generation, go where they spend the most amount of time, which is 35 hours a week in school. I would equate education to a gigantic tsunami-sized wave that is crashing into our nation, into our cities, redefining and reshaping our culture. Now, sure, there are other factors that are in those waves. There's poverty, there's breakdown of family, there's social disruption, economic fears, all of those things. But at the crest of that wave, exerting a formidable amount of influence for good, which we'll get to in just a moment, or for ill, is education. 68% of 8th graders cannot read at grade level. We've seen some of these before. 1.2 million students drop out of high school each year. That's about 6,000 students every school day, or one every 26 seconds. $300 billion in lost wages and taxes and productivity due to dropouts. But the issue that I want us to look at lies beneath mere test results or dropout rates. Something far more serious than even the failure to train the mind. It is the wholesale abandonment of forming a human soul. For those who do graduate and enter into the work world today, they're prone to make poor decisions, forget the learnings of the past, follow the masses around them. G.K. Chesterton once said, education is the soul of a society as it passes from one generation to the next. And the fallout of the failed dehumanizing educational model that many of us went through ourselves, that's dominated the last 100 years of education, is impacting almost every aspect of our society. Regardless of what you do, you're impacted by it. Whether you're in business or medicine, whether you're involved in farming or ministry, every one of us is impacted by this model of education, and its impact is far more serious than any of us understand or think that it is. So in the next few moments, I want to show you what's happened in the last 100 years. I want to explain why it matters to you, and I want to share with you and show to you a model that would allow us to recapture education as a formidable tool to shape hearts and minds for Jesus Christ. Let me model for you what education has largely looked like for the past 100 years. The mind is almost exclusively what progressive education, which is the name for education for the past 100 years, has had to focus on. You know, there's very little interest or ability for schools today to address anything soul-related. They might have a values class, or they might talk a little bit about being nice to your neighbor, but functionally their whole world is all around educating the mind. And if you're focusing on the mind, you're really in the information dissemination business. You're really only able to focus on data. And that data usually comes in the form of a fairly pre-digested textbook that looks a lot like a magazine. And that content is then presented to the child, and after a certain period of time, the educator then produces a test to evaluate and make sure that that child got a proper understanding of that information, much like a computer programmer putting data into a computer. We all know the drill. You get the test given to you on a Friday, but you wait until Thursday night to cram for it. You take it on Friday, and then Monday what happens? Well, you've kind of forgotten about it, and then they give you a whole other set of data. The challenge already with this model is that it's hard to get excited about it. And so students tend to want to drop out. It's a bit like trying to get little Johnny to eat a mouthful of sawdust. It's not really all that interesting. And so educators have discovered we've got to sweeten it up a little bit. We've got to make education fun. After all, what's the number one question parents ask their children when they pick them up from school? Did you have fun today? And if the response is, no, Mom, they made me do multiplication tables. That bad old school, let me go talk to them. We're going to straighten this out right away. And so educators begin to respond to this pressure. And they hire video game programmers to come in and make the content of the curriculum much more palatable and interesting, appealing to shorter attention spans, appealing to more child-centered educational models. Eventually, schools discover that keeping the fun up will even require things like bribing students. And you see schools today that pay students to actually take the test and do well on it. Nonetheless, even curriculum designers come up with more exciting ways to entertain, moving from education to edutainment. But nonetheless, the process must continue on. And so educators have to give more data, increasing in its complexity, but nonetheless information and data, and then tests are given. Tests take on an even more sophisticated form. Now they're called things like ACTs and SATs, effectively reducing the decision of whether a person is educated to a numerical score. As that child graduates, that score dictates where they go next. Most of them head off to college or to graduate school, and they're encouraged to then specialize around even more highly trained skill training. Students are asked earlier than ever to declare a major, and that skill training forces them to become less and less well-rounded and more focused on a very narrow set of specialties. But ultimately, they graduate and they head out into the world and they join the ranks of other producers and consumers with a confidence that they have been well educated. Heather Wilson, who has spent the last 20 years selecting candidates for the very exclusive Rhodes Scholarship Program, says that the graduates coming out of the top U.S. colleges and universities are what she calls superficial scholars. She says, for example, a young service academy cadet who is likely to be serving in a war zone within the year believes there are things worth dying for, but doesn't seem to have thought through much about what is worth killing for. Or a student who has started a chapter of Global Zero at his university hasn't really thought about whether a world in which great powers have divested themselves of nuclear weapons would be more stable or less so, or whether nuclear deterrence can ever be moral. Another example would be a graduate who wants to study comparative government but doesn't seem to know about the important features and limitations of the American Constitution. These individuals are specialized, but they're utterly dehumanized. And I would say that most of our Christian schools today effectively follow a progressive model of education. They just add a chapel service on Friday or maybe a devotional somewhere in there. But effectively, it's the same progressive model of education that's been around for the last 100 years. Education, however, has not always been this way. About 100 years ago, a guy named Horace Mann and another guy named John Dewey came along, and they looked at the American education system that had legacies all the way back to the Greek and Roman days. And they said, you know, American education's really rather impractical. After all, why would you need to train somebody to know Shakespeare if your goal for them is ultimately to turn a wrench on a factory floor? Why go through all the difficult task of teaching them to be someone when you really just need them to do something? This resonated very well with an increasingly industrialized America. And pretty soon, students began to take their places not in the classrooms but on factory floors where they began to work, sometimes to the point of abuse. The schools left the world of formation and landed almost completely in the world of information. And there were very dire results that somehow, in many ways, echoed Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. So what are we going to do about this problem, this challenge that's plagued us for the last 100 years? Well, C.S. Lewis has said that when we've lost our way, the best way forward is usually to go home. 2,000 years ago, a tsunami wave smashed onto the shores of a very pagan world. Out of that world came a complete transformation of a Greek and a Roman civilization. That later the Christians came and added ideas of what is true and good and beautiful. It was classical Christian education as it's called today, although in truth that education is largely limited to really what I would just call Christian education, because most education prior to 1900 was basically classical. That image, by the way, is a great example of that modern model of education that sees a person's value really in what they can accomplish. But in the world of classical education, the birth of some of the greatest thinkers of Western civilization came about. Think about it. Alexander the Great to Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson to Winston Churchill. Where did the major universities of the West come from? From Oxfords and Cambridge and Harvards. They came from people who had a classical education. What about the great medical facilities or the great humanitarian agencies? 100 years ago, the average farmer could quote from Homer's Iliad, had a broad understanding and broad knowledge of a variety of disciplines, and was very well versed as well in the area of scripture and theology. It's an amazing thing to consider the power of the mind when it's fully nurtured. So let me model for you what classical Christian education looks like. It begins with an assumption that we're not only going to train the mind for sure. We're going to train the mind not just in a limiting factor, but to the God's given potential for that individual child. And with equal passion, we're going to train up the soul of the child, knowing that there is a lordship of Christ over all of life, and that no aspect of life should be left out. Classical education builds on the model of broad content, not predigested textbooks, but content that stood the test of time. Content that's in the original source material, that's filled with the true and the good and the beautiful. Stories of heroes and heroines that speak to the human saga of triumph and tragedy, dealing with life in all of its rawness and realness. Classical education is built on a three-step model called the trivium, that means the three roads. It begins in the grammar stage. If you've heard of a grammar school, then you understand that this is the elementary stage, when children have a natural propensity to remember facts and remember ideas. And so using creative methods such as rhyming and song, we teach them basic hooks or fill their little mental storage compartments with information that they can rely on for the rest of their lives. At Heritage, we use a system that allows our elementary school students to memorize 32 facts per year on history. And they know that through a song, so that by the time they get to fourth grade, they've got 128 historical facts that they can then pull back on. We also begin to teach Latin in the elementary grades, which is a wonderful precursor to all Romantic languages. Well, as students move forward into the middle school years, if you've been around a middle schooler, they love to ask questions, so we like to teach them logic. If you've ever been around students who've had formal training in logic, they're a dangerous group of middle schoolers. They love life, but you ought to watch them. You should have seen our middle schoolers back during the presidential debates when they were running circles around the various candidates' positions and showing all kinds of logical breakdowns in their arguments. Ultimately, a child moves into high school and they enter into the rhetoric stage, where they learn to express themselves with creative words and allow themselves to then put together all of this information, ultimately producing a leader. You know, the average American is going to change jobs 12 times in their lifetime. And I can tell you, if you've got a classical education, you stand a much better chance to be able to move between one job to the next without the fear of wondering, are you going to be able to handle the challenges that are coming at you? Classical schools are growing around the country. In fact, they are on the rise, and they're not just in places where you might suspect in suburbia or in a homeschool environment. In fact, classical schools are merging together. The Association of Classical Christian Schools, for instance, has seen about a 60% growth in the last 10 years in the number of students that are involved in classical schools. And other consortiums and groups like the Institute for Classical Schools is coming together to support these groups. Classical schools are also appearing in a variety of settings. Like in Hawaii, there's the Trinity Classical School that takes this basic model of classical education and it includes not only Latin, but also Japanese because of the cultural context. There are classical schools in Korea and Iraq, and there are schools in big cities, in urban environments, like my school, Heritage, or the Geneva Classical School in Manhattan, where Gabe Lyons has his children. You'd be interested to know, too, that what is really encouraging to me is that classical schools have also been extremely successful in some of the more challenging environments where often other school models have failed. This is the Oaks Academy in Indianapolis, Illinois. 50% of the students are below poverty level. 25% are middle class and 25% are upper class. The output of this school is very impressive. Not only do these students do well on the standardized test in the top 10 to 15%, but they are very well-rounded and they're confident in who they are. The Oaks Academy went on 5 years ago to start a high school and to call it Heron High School in Indianapolis. Started in 2005. It was voted last year by Newsweek magazine one of the top 26 high schools in the nation. It's an amazing success story, and at root is a model of classical Christian education. The results are very impressive. I want to conclude with a story of Dr. Ben Carson. Ben Carson grew up in the inner city of Detroit. He was not classically trained in a classical school, but he was trained by a mother who understood the value of this type of education. Despite the poverty and the brokenness, despite the fact that Ben was angry and not interested in school, his mother had the wisdom, even though she was illiterate, to say, "Ben, I want you to go to the public library, and I want you to check out 2 books a week, and I want you to write a book report." Well, pretty soon, Ben began to read more broadly. In fact, he began to enjoy reading. Soon his grades began to improve. He became one of the top students in his class. He got interested in the arts. He went to the art museums and he began to listen to classical music, even though he was told by his peers that that music wasn't culturally relevant for him. Ben Carson ultimately went on to receive a full scholarship from Yale, then the University of Michigan, one of the top public medical schools in the country. He then became the youngest resident director at Johns Hopkins University in pediatric neurosurgery. Ben Carson later became a pioneer in very challenging surgeries like the separation of conjoined twins. Ben Carson received 61 honorary doctorates, and he's an amazing example of the heroic transformation of a life of someone who simply allowed themselves to be educated more broadly. And to this day, while some would argue he is the most specialized in pediatric neurosurgery, he also listens to classical music in his operating room. And he's a committed Christian and a passionate follower of Christ. And so in conclusion, I just want us to recognize that if we're serious about cultural engagement, we have an opportunity to leverage one of the greatest forces that we have at our disposal, which is education. And before us are these incredible lost tools that have the ability to reshape a mind and reform a culture. It is what we call the ancient future education, and I encourage you to find ways to support it and get involved in your community. Thank you very much.